Welcome to Twice 5 Miles Radio, an imaginative storm podcast, offering you fertile ground for conversations worth listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Nave. This show was aired first on WPVM FM out of Asheville, North Carolina. Thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song. WalterParks.com for more of Walter's music. Today, my guest is Rosemerry Wahtola Trommer. Rosemerry lives in Placerville, Colorado, not too far from Telluride, Colorado. Rosemerry served as San Miguel County's first Poet Laureate, 2007 to 2011. She was the Western Slope Poet Laureate, 2015 through 2017, and she was the finalist for Colorado Poet Laureate 2019. I opened our conversation by asking Rosemerry how control plays into the creative work she does. And here's what she said.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Nave. It makes me think of the first time I came to Telluride, where I live now. I met a man named Art Goodtime. Standing on the street. Art Goodtimes is a man who looks just like the crazy gnomish character with big old beard, and he wears a giant top hat and drives a red pickup truck that looks like an amanita mushroom with white polka dots. So Art Goodtimes also loves poems. And he says to me, Rosemerry, hey, you write poems? Show me some poems. And I handed him a handful of poems that I've been writing. And he looks at them and he says, these are nice. I wonder what would happen if you relaxed. It was the best, Nave. Not at the time, perhaps, but he was right. I was writing these super tight, controlled, inscrutable poems right through. I had a lot of control in those poems. I wonder what would happen if you relaxed. And I feel like so much of creative process, and it's taken me how many decades to get to the point where I do relax, where there's a great amount of trust. So every time I sit down to a blank page, I really trust something will happen, and I'm actually not in charge of it. In fact, more to the point, my job is to get out of the way, right? To serve the poem. This is almost everything, right? For me, anyway, now, is learning to show up in more of a state of surrender. The more I surrender to the process, the more thrilled I am about what actually happens. Control. Control's a funny thing. Isn't that interesting? I hadn't thought of it in terms of that word, control, but really that is so much of what happens when I'm meeting a blank page is letting go of control as much as possible. I mean, it's never completely possible, let's face it.
So when you say surrender to the poem, and I'm asking this, those of you listening out there will be interested to know the reason I'm asking this is because I also write poetry, and I'm always wondering about how to surrender to it. And I've done it a long time, and maybe you out there listening, you've written poetry too, and maybe you've surrendered to the poem. But as you said it this time, Rosemerry, surrendered to the poem, I thought, I'm not exactly sure what that means. I mean, when you say surrender, you give up. And do you give up to the poem, or do you give up to the process? What are you surrendering to?
Well, here's one example of how this plays out, right? I might know today I want to write a poem about kindness. I got in my head the other day, I wanted to write a poem about really powerful engines, horsepower. Now, I didn't know where that poem was going to go, right? So I don't mean per se that I show up completely blank, although I am not averse to that. I am not averse to just sitting there for a long time with a blank page. But in this case, I had some idea, okay, I'm going to write a poem about an engine. Oh, yeah, well, we could braid that with kindness. What's going to happen? Now, the thrill of it, for me, at least part of the thrill, is to not know what will happen, right? To not know the ending when I start. And in fact, ideally, to not know the ending until I arrive at that ending. The moment you know where the poem is going to go, you have just erased all potential. Like when you first sit down to that blank page, basically we're sitting down to infinite potential. anything could happen. Anything could happen, right? Ways we get in the way, ways I get in the way. I want it to be good. Like if I want it to be good, that's how I get in the way, right? Like, because then I'm just constantly thinking, but is that good? Is that good? Is that good? Years ago, I learned I had to throw that out right off the bat, writing something to be good. That will never work. What I switch that with is it true? Is it authentic? Is there juice in that? Now that juice, that's where it's all at, right? That's exciting. You know that feeling, you know? When I'm allowing myself to be led by that juice, by that truth, by that authenticity, by that experience, then, right, that's the magic. If I'm just sitting there to write down what I know already, that's boring. Like, why even bother? As a creative process, right? There are reasons. Like if I'm sitting there writing a manual on how to use your new blender, sure, I should know how to do it. I need to know where I'm going, right? But if I'm sitting down to write a poem, the thrill of it is to have that level of surrender that I don't know where this is going. I don't know. If I do know, then I have these little rules, Nave, or these little games really, where I'll write past the ending that I thought I knew, or I will write multiple endings, which is actually one of my favorite things to do, is just cut off the ending I think I know, and write another one, and write another one, and write another one.
So someone out there thinking about digging into their own work, their writing. So if somebody wanted to begin something like that, and again, I'm asking that, folks out there listening, I'm asking that because I've done this a long time and I'm still wondering how to do it. And maybe there's no answer to this because it's impossible. I think about the poetry that I write, and sometimes it's easy for me to write words and put them together loaded with all kinds of images, but I sometimes hide behind that. Rather than actually get down to saying, I'm really terrified that my cancer might come back. Now, in my mind, I don't think that's poetic. I'm terrified my cancer might come back, or I'm scared of COVID-19, or I feel like my whole life is full of loneliness right now. So all of those are aspects of truth that I'm dealing with, truth in the sense of how I'm emotionally feeling it. For someone out there, all of us actually probably are feeling some version of that. How do we get that onto a piece of paper, and why would we even do that? Why would we put it on a piece of paper?
Right? What a good question. What use is it anyway? What good is it?
I mean, maybe laughing may be the best poetic expression.
Well, Nave, I mean, a poem doesn't solve any problem. It doesn't cure any cancer. It doesn't bring peace to the world. No, it doesn't, which is why, because the poem itself can't do that. The poem can't. But that process of engaging with the poem, there is so much healing in that meeting the self, in that meeting the world, in that meeting the blank, in that making the connection between that inner experience. I'm afraid of getting cancer again. I'm afraid of what's happening with COVID. That inner experience, letting that, what I always call that, what's at stake, what's really at stake. Like a poem wants to have something at stake. Otherwise, who cares, right? Who cares? But if we start with that, what's at stake? I'm afraid I'm going to get cancer again. And then we let that inner experience meet what's happening around us, right, in the world. There's snow in the field, and it's all new now, There's something gorgeous. It's a gorgeous healing process that happens. It's transformative, right? When I sit down with that question and I look around me and I write them both, it's a conversation, right? And I always think of a poem this way, as a bridge between the inner world of our feelings, our questions, our fears, our wonderings, and the outer world of our experience, the sensory world of touch and smell and taste and what we see. When we engage in that playground, it opens us up, right? It opens us up. And that opening, that act of opening, that act of curiosity, that engagement with wonder, that's what it's all about. See, I always think it's funny that the poem is what people hold up. Like, that's what matters, right? Do you have a book? Well, yeah, I've got books. But they're not the point. And those poems, the freaking thousands of poems that I've written, are not the point. They're like a pretty little artifacts. Well, some of them aren't so pretty. They're whatever kind of artifacts they are. But there was an amazing process that happened in which I showed up. And that is exciting. And that is the point. That's why we write poems. It's not for the poem. It's for that incredible wrestling act that happens when we sit down and see what'll happen when we show up with our fear and our wonder and our gratitude.
So that would relieve someone of the burden of generating fabulous material on the first try.
Yeah.
If someone's out there wanting to write a piece, thinking, gee, I'd like to give this a whirl, then you listening can feel quite free, because you are already asking the questions. Why am I lonely? Yeah. How am I going to grieve the death of a loved one I couldn't touch when they passed because of COVID-19? What am I going to say to my children who are at home with me and I'm falling short of educating them because I don't know how to do that? All of that cosmic stuff whirls around in our minds. And if we take a little time to jot it down on a piece of paper, it doesn't have to be anything other than some lines on a page that might relieve us of some of the stress.
Mm-hmm. Doesn't solve the problem, but it does help us meet the world. There was a long time there, Nave, where I really thought that poems could fix things, right? Like a poem could contain things, right? Like if the world was super messy, I could write it into a poem. This is back to control. So here it is. So I really thought that poems were a way to control. I really did. And those are the poems I was writing. And they were dead. There wasn't a lot of life in them. I don't want to say they didn't serve me. They did. All of that writing, all of it served me, right? I just think it's very funny now that I used to think, yeah, I could write a poem and learn something. And now I think I could write a poem and unlearn something. That's a way freer way to be, right? And you're so right in encouraging people. I often say when I'm leading writing workshops, I'm like, I hope you don't write anything good today. I hope that's not what happens. But I hope you write something so true that it blows the top of your head off, right? And then the sweet secret, of course, is that if you can write something so true that it blows the top of your head off, like Emily D would say, well, then it's going to have resonance with other people. And when it has resonance, they'll be like, oh my God, that poem's so good. But it isn't because you wrote a good poem. It's because you wrote something so true that it resonated, right? So when we start with truth, right? When we start with authenticity, when we start with that juice and that curiosity, and when that's what's driving us, yeah, I mean, now we're talking. Now you write a poem that someone else reads and goes, wow.
So when did you first realize poems won't save the world? Was that a slow process?
Yes.
It didn't happen one day you're looking out the window and a bear walks by and gives you the message. It's more a slow process. And how did you change when you realized poems can't save the world? How did that affect your identity as a poet?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Nave. I mean, it happened super gradually, right? I will say that the biggest key to this was writing a poem a day, because it was really clear right off the bat that I couldn't write a masterpiece every day, right? Which gave me incredible freedom for the first time in my writing to not try to make it good. Here's what happened, actually. And now I'm at this point 5 years into a poem a day practice. So I've been doing it a long time, and I already know it doesn't have to be good every day. But then my life totally fell apart. I actually had a full-on crisis. Everything that I thought was solid was not. And writing little poems that were tight and controlled everything really wasn't working. But it did show up that that was how I had been living, in a way that I was super tight and trying to control everything to make everything okay, make it okay, make it okay, make it okay. I mean, most of us are doing that, right? It's hard to live in another way. It's hard to live in a way that's so vulnerable and open that you're aware all the time that you don't have any control. That's terrifying. And it's totally true. When life totally fell apart, the poems obviously had to meet that, right? They had to be true to that. I'm still writing poems. I can't write about things being nice when they're not. I can't pretend that it's all nice and neat in there. I can't even take the messy stuff and put it in a messy little box and make it seem like it's all contained. The boxes kept opening. I had no control over it. And I would say that having everything fall apart, of course, sucks, but it was the very best thing that ever happened to my creative process. It opened everything up. It changed everything. How does writing poems in this way change the way I meet the world, right? Like, it's a reciprocal thing. The more willing I am to be in surrender with a poem on a page, the more willing I am to be in surrender on a day in 2020 when Telluride goes into code orange or code pink, I guess we're in now, which is like, they don't want to say red, so now they've called it pink. Because they want to control it, right? The truth is it's out of control, but then they create like a new little section called pink. And, we're going to end up with magenta before we get to red because we're trying to control it with this language. And that never works. That never works. Being able to practice that surrender with a page allows me to practice that surrender in every other part of life and just allow the world to unfold and meet it and meet it and meet it and meet it, as opposed to trying to control it. Who knew today's conversation was going to be about control? But man, this is fun.
This is really interesting. Well, I also want to continue on with this conversation about control. And I want to slightly turn the corner a little bit to the word you've used often, and I use it often, and we all do. Those listening out there probably have used it often as well. Good. Mm-hmm. You say, I want to give you permission to write a poem that's a bad poem, which is the opposite of a good poem. And we use that word good often as if we understand it. And I think we do. I think I understand what good is. I love chocolate cake that's well made. And I put it in my mouth and I say, that is good. Or the sun comes up and I look at the sun and I say, oh, that is good. So I use good a lot. And I use it within the context of things I understand. Like I've always enjoyed talking to you. And every time I have a conversation with you, like the one we're having now, I leave it and I go, that was good. I like that. So I equate good to like. When you talk about good in respect to a good poem, that must imply that a good poem can exist. Or does it? And what would make a poem good? How do we measure that?
Yeah, what a good question that is. They're a good question. I mean, here's what I can tell you is that I probably, I read so many poems a day. Not 10, 20, 30 poems a day. I don't actually like most of them. I think there are quite a few poems, like most poems I read, I'm like, 1 in 50. I'm like, oh, right? It's a full body resonant feeling with it. For whatever reason, it made me laugh. It made me feel known. It made me curious. It made me think, yeah, that's what it means to be alive. That's what it means to be alive. If I wanted to say what good art is, period, is when we experience it and we have kind of that resonant, opened up, curious, charged, juicy feeling. That's when a poem is good, right? Is when it gives me that. I always say there's so many ways to do it right. There's so many ways to do it right. It's not that only one kind of poem or one kind of dance or this sequence of words. Like I told you, I'll write 4 endings for a poem. Sometimes I kind of like them all. So many ways to do it right.
So maybe good is an inadequate word to describe this.
Totally.
And so you were describing, you read 30 poems, and one of the 30 maybe tingles, it maybe stimulates, it excites you, it maybe validates where you are coming from. And I could sit down with you and read the same 30, and I would find one in that collection of 30 that just completely shook me to my core. And you might think that same poem was a complete bore. There's a great deal of freedom in what we do as writers, or what we can do if we're starting out. And yet, of course, that does bring us around to something you've touched on as we've been in this conversation. You've been touching on the notion of doing something on a regular basis. Implied in that is some kind of rigor, some kind of desire to understand something about craft. So craft and rigor and thoughtfulness and practice has to be part of the goodness that emerges. So maybe we are speaking of goodness more than good. Do you feel goodness when you're working this process? Or does it feel like sandpaper on the skin?
Which actually, I'm not averse to sandpaper on the skin either, right? Like, I think some of my favorite poems are more like sandpaper than silk. I want to go back just to a second. Let's talk about rigor and craft in just a second. But I want to go back to something you said about how, the poem that I chose that made me tingle and your poem made you tingle, different poems, perhaps, right? And of course, this is true. This is so true. And I have never been more aware, Nave, than in the last 6 months, just how essential the reader response is to a poem. Back in March, the beginning of COVID, I started doing a lot of online poetry discussion classes. And in doing them so much, part of what I'm understanding is just how essential the reader is to the process, more maybe even than I understood before. If the poem is 50% of the interaction, the reader is the other 50. And what that reader brings determines how much of that poem is accessible to them or not. How ripe, there's a ripeness in a reader, and it's even in us, right? It's, I notice this in myself, how I will meet a poem 10 years ago, and then I read it 5 years later, I'm like, oh, I didn't get that before. And then I read it 5 years later, I'm like, really? What, that? How did I miss that? Because Jane Hirschfield has, what fools we were not to have seen. It's kind of thrilling, actually. It's why I love reading poems in groups. Because when other people bring whatever that is that they bring to the poem, it's thrilling. It's thrilling to have a conversation and meet the poem from all these different sides, all these different angles, all these different perspectives, and how they inform that poem and give life to the poem and give life to my understanding, give life to my own experience of that poem. It's so thrilling. Talking about poems, I've always enjoyed talking about poems with people, but never more than I do right now. Just with that thrill of that difference in experience each of us has with what we bring, where you get the tingle one place, I get it somewhere else. But then when you share with me your tingle, right? Then, I get contact tingle. It's like, it's awesome.
Contact tingle. That's it. Write that down, and you will be given credit for that someday in some academic class. Rosemerry Wahtola Trommer invented contact tingle. I think that's great. If you don't mind for just a second, I'd like to just pause to say to the folks who are listening, you are tuned in to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Nave. This show was aired first on WPVM LF Asheville 103.7 and online WPVMFM.org. Thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song, walterparks.com. If you would like to explore some really intriguing Americana music, all invented by Walter Parks himself, walterparks.com. I love his work, and I bet you will too. You can reach out to me, Nave, at jamesnave.com. Nave is spelled Nave. And also, I'd like to say we are sponsored by by Twice 5 Miles guides, the stuff nobody teaches you, little bits of information that will help you get your work over the finish line. And I might say, excuse me, I might say that the conversation Rosemerry and I are having would be part of that stuff nobody teaches you. And we are discovering it as we go along. So if you're interested in the stuff nobody teaches you, twice5miles.com. And so now I'd like to get back to this wonderful conversation with Rosemerry. And we were talking about contact tingle. What a term. So not only are we talking about poetry, we're talking about using language to invent something to describe a feeling that we have. And we were also talking about crafts. So can we pick it back up there, Rosemerry, and continue on? What do you say?
Let's pick it up there. Let's pick it up there. Well, you were talking about, before we got into contact tingle, you were talking a little bit about craft and about, maybe this is where control comes back in, right? Because the truth is that there are things that we can do, and I know many of them, and I know you do too. There are things that we can do that increase the chance of getting the tingle, right? It's no mistake, right, that Mary Oliver wrote so many poems that hit it out of the park. Well, how did she do that? What was she doing? What kinds of tools did she use? For instance, I love the interview that she did with Krista Tippett in On Being, where she takes that poem, Wild Geese, which is a favorite of so many people. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. And she said that poem began as an exercise in end stop lines. So that's a great example of, there are ways then, once we've written a poem. I think of craft also, by the way, as still serving the poem. It's still more about serving the poem than it is about kind of imposing what I want. But I think it'd be wrong to say that I don't have some ideas already based on writing how many thousands of poems. I have some good ideas. And so something like end stop lines, right? What happens when you choose to end a line with a period or a comma each time? Or if not each time, like in Wild Geese, most of the time, right? It creates a certain kind of tone. In fact, it creates a certain tone, I think, of authority, right? These smaller, shorter statements. That's not a one-to-one equivalent. You couldn't say that. It'd be very easy to prove that wrong. And yet, the more you play with it, of course, the better you understand it, the more you know it, and you can manipulate it better, and you can be manipulated by it better, right? And sometimes it's fun to see what happens if you choose a parameter like, I'm going to write a poem that has a period at the end of each line, and see where that takes you. So I think the more we know about how to play with sound, how to play with rhythm, how to play with image, how to play with the back and forth between the show and tell, for instance, that's a great playground, right? That's fun. There's so much fun to be had there. You can have some of that fun during the writing process, but so much of that happens after the writing process also, where you can go back in and say, well, what would happen if? What would happen if? I suppose then we're back to choices. I could have an enjambed line where it chooses to run on to the next line, or I could stop it there. What's the difference? How does it make me feel? Does that serve the poem? Which one serves the poem?
I'm thinking of the skill, the craft, and I'm also thinking of the people listening, those of you out there listening, thinking maybe I would like to try my hand at this. I'm also thinking of all of the skills that we have acquired, everything that we do as makers. We say poets make things, poets make poems. You make a dinner, you make a career, you learn how to knit, you learn how to play tennis or play any other sport for that matter, or you learn how to play a board game, learn how to draw, learn how to play a musical instrument. And all of us, everyone listening, you are learning things constantly. And we've all had the experience of learning something so thoroughly. We have such unconscious competence that we don't give it a thought, and then we can enjoy ourselves. Probably for most people listening, the most common learning experience we've had as adults, we've learned how to drive cars. Now, not everybody drives a car. There are a lot of people who don't know how to drive a car, but clearly there are plenty of people who do. Those of you listening who know how to drive a car, I'll bet you've had plenty of great conversations with a friend while you're driving to the store or on a long road trip, giving no thought to the tractor trailer trucks passing, or the car in front of you giving its signal to go over to the right-hand lane so you can pass it at 65, 70, even 80 miles an hour. That's a very difficult thing to do, really, to talk and drive, because driving is a very complicated thing, and yet we're very skilled at it. So I love to think of poetry and writing in the same way that I think of all the other things that we've learned. Something you start out doing, and slowly you get better and better. And better means you are able to play more, have more of a range, wallow a little bit in the sense of no control, letting the imagination have its own currency over the control. The imagination has a different kind of control than what I can do with the period at the end of the line.
It's interesting too. I hadn't thought of this as a control thing earlier, Nave, but probably one of the more recent revelations out of this practice is that there were many, many, many years where I would always have pen and paper with me, right? Because I didn't want to miss it. And you know that's what happens. You have that great idea, and if you don't write it down, it is gone, right? That's how it is. I don't know when I stopped carrying that pen and paper around. I mean, I still carry note cards with me everywhere, but it's more for lists. It's practical because I forget stuff. But I realized I don't have to catch them all. I don't have to. And there was something so freeing about that if that exciting idea leaves, there is another and another and another and another and another. And the thrill of that and the freedom of that and the trust in that has been amazing. I think it keeps me from feeling like any of it gets too precious, right? Like I have to hold on to it. Don't lose it. Well, it's okay if you lose it. It's okay. You will have another. You will. Many.
Like a breath, you will always have another breath.
Yeah, until we don't.
Well, speaking of breath and speaking of having another, I know you're at your desk, and before we work our way all the way through this show, I'd love for you to offer as a gift some of the work that you do. Do you have some new or old poems that we could hear? And I think you do, Rosemerry.
Oh, I'm sure I have a poem or two.
Roll your eyes a bit and come up with something magical. No pressure.
Here's one of my favorite. It's a recent favorite. Well, here it goes. While watching my friend pretend her heart isn't breaking. On Earth, just 1 teaspoon of neutron star would weigh 6 billion tons. 6 billion tons is the equivalent weight of every animal on Earth, including the insects, times 3. 6 billion tons. Sounds impossible until I consider what it is to swallow grief. Just 1 teaspoon, and one may as well have consumed a neutron star. How dense it is, how it carries in it the memory of collapse. How impossible to believe anyone could ever lift that weight. There are many reasons to treat each other with great tenderness. One is the sheer miracle that we are here on a planet together, surrounded by dying stars. And the other is none of us can see what anyone else has swallowed.
Beautiful. As you were saying that piece, I tingled a bit when I started to think about the teaspoon. Did you say tablespoon or teaspoon?
Teaspoon. Yeah.
Teaspoon, not a tablespoon, a teaspoon of grief. And the idea that by swallowing it, taking it in as almost as nutrition, our body will then do something with it. Our body takes what it needs and ejects the rest. My friend Roger Bonaire-Agar, in an interview that I did with him last week, talked about the idea of poetry as nutrition, eating the plants that grow right around you, taking them in. So the idea is you don't have to import food. You take it right where it is in the season that it's in. So when you consume grief in the teaspoon, you're consuming the immediate nutrition around you. That's where my mind went when we talked about grief.
Yeah, I like that. And I like very much your friend's idea about consuming, where you're at. I think so much about how much I love, right? Reading poems by people who live in a certain area. I love the poems by the people in this community, right? And by community, I mean Western Slope of Colorado and down into New Mexico. The people who live in this region and who are writing right now. It is such a gift to read their work, right? To know what they're experiencing right now. It's a little more digestible, right, in some ways, right? It's like it's served with enzymes because of what we share, right? We share this geographic place. We share this moment in time. When I was Western Slope Poet Laureate, I had a project called Herd of Poets. It was HEARD, Herd of Poets. And I was working with a newspaper who did all the tech work on this for me. Once a week, I would have a poet from somewhere in our region. We'd put them on the map with a picture of where they live and a poem about whatever. It was kind of marvelous, really. As well as Stegner says, no place is a place until it has a poet. It's quite something to know a place through its poets, the ones who are all right around us.
And that also suggests that we can trust ourselves and trust where we are and trust where we're from. We don't have to go too far afield to have an entire universe to work with. Do you have another piece you would like to read?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Here's a new one. This is from my newest book. This is Hush. It's a book of poems about human ecology, so our relationship to the natural world and to each other. This is a poem for this year, by golly. Big. This is perhaps the year to learn to be big. Spruce tree big, cliffside big, big as mesa, as mountain lake, big as in cosmos, as in love. Being small has never served me. Constricting, contorting, trying to fit into a room, into shoes, into a name. Let this be the year to escape all those little rules with their little shoulds, all those little cages with their little locks. Time to make of myself a key. Time to lean into immensity. Time to supersize communion. Time to grow beyond self. Time to open, to unwall, to do as the universe does, accelerating as I expand, not rushing toward something else. No, but changing the scale of space itself. The year to be big, Nave.
I love the idea of moving toward this universal thing, and my mind went to how fast the earth spins, how fast we're moving right now. And yet, of course, everybody listening and you and I we think we're sitting still, but in fact, we're just zipping along. And, it brings me around what I'd like to offer something up as a poem, because we're talking about geography, and I come from Western North Carolina. I often tend to, even though I'm now in Taos, I tend to draw my inspiration from Western North Carolina. So this is just a very short poem I wrote about place. And it goes like this. Late last winter, I think it was around February, a friend of mine and I walked up a steep, brambly Appalachian road to a knoll where 100-year-old cabin overlooked a ravine which sloped to a creek headed down valley from the numerous springs on the hills above. Below the roofline, someone had nailed new boards to the cabin's side. Evergreens and what was left of the front yard curved from the shaping of wind absent as I stood by the porch in the warm afternoon sun. The chimney's my favorite part, my friend said, but I think it's about to fall. I believe the mud daubers are the only things holding it together. The post under the porch leaned into the hillside. The roof was rusty. I'll bet this place is beautiful in the springtime, I said. Oh, it sure is, she said. We dallied around for about a half an hour, and then after that, we walked back down the dirt road along an old fence line. 3 crows sat in the trees. A few dogs barked as the afternoon sun settled above the western ridge. So that's a true story. My friend Natalie Kenzie and I walked up a steep, brambly Appalachian road, and she wanted to show me this cabin up there. Somebody was trying to repair it, but it was really old, and it did have a lot of those creaky boards still hanging onto the sides. So we draw from our own sense of things, our own sense of place. I wonder if it will ever end. Will you ever stop writing poetry?
Oh, gosh, I hope not. I've often thought, if I lived alone on a desert island, would I still write a poem every day? I kind of think I would.
I've gone in and out of writing poetry. Sometimes I'll write poems every day. But what happens to me often is I'll just get so many of them, I don't know what to do with them. So,
you don't have to do anything.
I mean, they're just piled up one after the other. And of course, that the one about the Appalachian Road came out of the poem a day. So now I'm not doing a poem a day anymore. I've shifted to something else. But now that I'm talking to you, I'm thinking, well, maybe I should get back to it.
Here's the thing, Nave. It would be easy to not write a poem every day. I think sometimes people, you do it because you have to, right? Like you're driven to. Actually, it'd be really easy to not write. And yet, it changes the quality of life so much. That's why I'm unwilling to lose it, right? It changes the way I meet the world every day, every minute. It's that profound. And that's why I won't stop. That's why I won't stop. It isn't about the thousands of poems. Who knows? I mean, I'm terribly organized about them. It's like I was saying earlier, that the poems actually aren't really the point. They're really not. It's the way it changes the quality of life. That's the point. That's what's exciting. And to be honest, the other thing that's interesting is, I've been sharing them every day with the public for over 10 years. So anybody who wanted to read my first drafts could read them on my blog, or you can sign up and I'll email them to you every day. Thousands of people get my first drafts every day, which is, of course, stupid. Like, who puts their first drafts out into the world? But what's thrilling about that, too, is that I have a chance firsthand to know, because people write me every day and say, that poem, that's what I needed today. Thank you. So I have a strong sense, a daily sense of entering into a big conversation with people, and an affirmation every day that the poems are doing their work, that they're out there meeting people in a way that helps them show up.
So if someone would like to engage with you to meet these poems and read them every day, how would they do that?
You can go to 100fallingveils.com. That's all spelled out. 100fallingveils.com. So you can read them there. And while you're there, if you want them sent to your inbox every day, you can sign up for that there. They also go out on MailChimp. So you can either just read them on screen or have them sent to your inbox. If you are interested in seeing some of the other stuff I'm up to, I have a podcast called Emerging Form, and that's at emergingform.com about creative process. A really fun poetry series called Stubborn Praise that I do every other month with James Cruz. We have Laura Foley coming up in December and Naomi Shihab Nye coming up in February. You can find out about that on my website, which is wordwoman.com. Wordwoman.com.
Well, Rosemerry, that's a perfect place to close our conversation. Thank you ever so much for coming back for a second time as a guest on this show. And do you have any closing words for the folks listening before we go?
Well, if you're wondering about writing a poem, I'm sure you can do it. I have 1,000% confidence that if you can write a list, you can write a poem. Why not? Why not play? See what shows up if you show up.
Oh, thank you so much for showing up, Rosemerry Wahtola Trommer.
Thanks, Nave, for inviting people to show up. I'm pretty delighted to hang out with you. It's really fun.
There you go, my friends, my conversation with Rosemerry Wahtola Trommer. Thank you so much for listening. If you do have time on Saturday and would like to join me and Allegra Houston, my creative collaborator, for our Imaginative Storm Writing Prompt of the Week gathering, it's a workshop, it's a salon, it's a conversation. We work for an hour and then we spend a half an hour discussing the work. It's a wonderful gathering. It's always free. You can find the Zoom link at imaginativestorm.com. imaginativestorm.com, and you can always reach me, Nave, at imaginativestorm.com. Nave spelled Nave. So once again, thank you for listening to Twice 5 Miles Radio, an Imaginative Storm podcast, offering you fertile ground for conversations with listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Nave, and I do hope you come back soon. And until then, I'll catch you on that turnaround somewhere down the line.